Hello, this is Mrs. Grosch, and the topic for this lecture is the solar system. And the solar system seems huge to us, but really is just our little neighborhood in a really, really big universe. One thing people often get confused about is how many solar systems are there in the universe? Well, actually there's only one. Star systems, well, there could be a star system around each star. It's really just the star and then anything that's affected by that star's gravity. And we're just beginning to discover planets that circle stars other than ours. But our star, which is called Sol, has its own star system, and we call it the solar system. So there's really only one solar system, and it's the star system that we live in. One thing you should know about the solar system is that the sun and then everything around it that was created as part of the solar system is about 4.5 billion, 4.6 billion to be a little more exact, years old. And it's huge. Let's just say that you had a Lamborghini. If you could start it at the sun and drive it at the speed that a Lamborghini can go towards the outside of the solar system, you wouldn't even get to Pluto until 6,000 years had passed. And then you'd have to keep driving for about 19 million more years to get to the edge of our solar system. So it's incredibly enormous to us, but it's actually just a very tiny part of the universe. When we think about what's in the solar system, we probably first think about the planets. Now, there are 8 planets in our solar system, and I don't think they ever line up nicely like you see in this picture, but this is a way to show their relative sizes and distances from the sun. The picture you see is supposed to be to scale according to size, but it's not also to scale according to distance. If you tried to do that, it would never fit on a single screen. Here are the names of the planets in order from closest to the sun to farthest away. The first one, which is the closest, is Mercury, and then you have Venus, Earth, Mars, and then you can see the rest of the planets are much bigger. Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and finally Neptune. Each one of those planets has their own path on which they orbit the sun. The farther away they are, the bigger that orbit is, and the longer it takes for the planet to go around the sun. That's what determines the length of the planet's year. Many of the planets also have moons. Moons are natural satellites that go around the planet. They're held in orbit according to the planet's gravity. We, of course, have a moon we're familiar with. Some planets have many moons. Do you see that picture? It's got a lot of the moons named for different planets. Please don't think that you have to memorize them. You don't. There are some other things in our solar system, too. There are some dwarf planets. Of course, we all know about Pluto. We used to call it a planet, but it got demoted because even though it is a spherical shape and it does go around the sun, it isn't big enough to be considered a true planet. There are a couple of other dwarf planets as well. There are smaller chunks of rock called asteroids. Some of them are quite large, but they're not big enough to make a spherical shape. That spherical shape comes from a pull of gravity from inside the object. And asteroids just aren't big enough to have that, so they mostly just look like random chunks of rock. Most, but not all, asteroids are found clustered between Mars and Jupiter, and we call that collection of asteroids the asteroid belt. There are also comets. Comets are not rock exactly. They're mostly balls of dust and ice, and they do orbit the sun, but they have very big orbits, so we usually don't see them on a regular basis. We usually divide the planets into 2 groups. The first group are the 4 planets that are the closest to the sun. We call them the inner planets, but they're also sometimes called the rocky planets because they're all made out of solid rock. They have some things in common. Compared to the other planets, they're really rather small, and they're relatively warm because they're so close to the sun. They all have a core and a mantle and a crust. But there's also some facts about each planet that you might be interested in learning. For example, Mercury. It's the smallest planet that is considered a true planet. Pluto is smaller, but we don't call that one a planet anymore. So it's the smallest true planet, and it's the closest to the Sun, which means it has the shortest year. A lot of people think that Mercury must be the hottest planet because it's so close to the Sun. And while it's true it has very hot days, it has no atmosphere to hold in the heat at night. So on average, it's actually not the hottest planet. It has very hot days, but very cold nights. Because it doesn't have an atmosphere, when meteors get close enough to it to collide with it, they make huge meteor craters because there's no atmosphere to burn up those meteors or slow them down. Venus is quite different from Mercury. It's almost the same size as Earth, but it has a very, very thick carbon dioxide atmosphere, which gives it an incredible greenhouse effect. That's what makes Venus the hottest planet in our solar system. Even though it doesn't get quite as hot as Mercury during the day, it keeps in that heat. So on average, it's hotter than any other planet because of its greenhouse effect. It has volcanoes, which is part of how that carbon dioxide gets produced. And it rotates in a direction that's backward from the other planets. We call that retrograde rotation. I would imagine you're familiar with the next planet, the planet Earth. When you're comparing it to other planets, some things that you might want to be aware of is that it's the only planet with liquid water at its surface. It's about 71% liquid at the surface. Our atmosphere contains oxygen and nitrogen, and because of the oxygen especially, it's the only planet known to support life. One reason that Earth is so special, well, we live here, which makes it special, but one reason why it's special is because it has liquid water. Many planets are either too close to the Sun or far away from the Sun to have water that's in a liquid form. One planet in our solar system that may have had water on its surface at one time is Mars. Mars is our closest neighbor in the solar system, if you don't count the Moon. And it's a planet that we sometimes call the red planet. It is sort of a rusty red color if you look at it through a telescope, and that's because it has a chemical called iron oxide on its surface. It has an atmosphere, but it's a very thin atmosphere made mostly of carbon dioxide. Scientists have found frozen water at the poles on Mars. We haven't found any liquid water on its surface anymore, but there are canyons carved out of the surface of Mars, kind of like the Grand Canyon was carved out by a river. So maybe at one point there was liquid water on the surface of Mars. Another thing that's interesting about Mars is it has the largest volcano in our solar system. If you keep working your way out through the solar system, once you get past Mars, you would go through the asteroid belt, and then you get to the outer planets. And those outer planets are sometimes called the gas giants because they're made of gas and, well, they're giant. Some things that they have in common. They're all much, much bigger than the rocky planets. They do have a small, solid core, but that's surrounded by gases and some ice. They're much farther than the Sun, which makes them colder, and it also makes their years much longer. And most of them have lots of moons because they do have a strong pull of gravity. They're so big, so they have lots of moons that revolve around them. The largest planet in our solar system is Jupiter. One thing that's really interesting about Jupiter, even though it's very huge, it has an extremely fast rotation. One day, so one rotation for Jupiter, is only about 10 Earth hours long. And because of that incredibly fast rotation, it has a lot of disruptions in its atmosphere, including a giant storm, which some people call the Big Red Spot. It's right here. And people think that that's actually a hurricane. It's bigger than all of planet Earth, so it's enormous. Another very well-known planet is Saturn. Saturn is best known for its beautiful rings. The rings are actually made out of dust and rocks and ice, and that material is just revolving around Saturn in that pattern that makes the rings that we can see. One interesting fact about Saturn is that it's the windiest planet. It has winds that are over 1,000 kilometers per hour. The next two planets look similar. Uranus and Neptune both look blue. Uranus is a very cold planet, and one thing that's interesting about it is it rotates on an axis that is horizontal. So its axis goes across that way. That's not a very good horizontal line, but you get the idea. And then it rotates that way instead of on a vertical axis, which is what we're more familiar with. Neptune also looks blue. The blue color comes from methane that's in its atmosphere. Neptune is the farthest planet from the sun that's still in our solar system, and that means that it's the coldest planet and that it has the longest year. So that's a very brief introduction to all of the interesting things that are in our solar system, and we'll learn more about it over the next few days. Thanks for listening to this lecture. I'll see you in class tomorrow.